October 7th, 2001. Transports landed. Boots hit the dust. Afghanistan was a fortress of sharp mountains, deserts, and ancient villages. Following the September 11th attacks, America demanded justice. Why did they expect a short fight? The plan seemed solid. Strike hard, eliminate the Taliban, go home. The footage shows heavy convoys navigating narrow passes. At first glance, absolute dominance, but in reality, the enemy was waiting. Calculations failed. The quick war dissolved. It turned into 20 years of ambushes and coffins. The land became a graveyard of dreams. It ended in blood. October 7th, 2001. Less than 30 days had passed since the towers fell in New York. The American response was immediate. Operation Enduring Freedom began with a single objective: to decapitate the Taliban regime and burn al-Qaeda out of its safe havens. The attack did not start with boots on the ground. It started from the air. The roar of jet engines drowned out the wind over Kabul. Bombers and cruise missiles struck with precision. Training camps exploded into dust. Communication arrays shattered. Government compounds turned to rubble within hours. How do you invade a country known as the graveyard of empires? You do not go alone. You buy allies. While the airstrikes hammered the cities, CIA officers and special forces teams infiltrated the valleys. They linked up with the Northern Alliance. These local fighters had battled the Taliban for years. They knew every rock and crevice. The Americans brought air support, but they also brought something else. The footage shows operatives opening heavy duffel bags. Inside, bricks of $100 bills. Money bought loyalty from local warlords. The terrain was too rough for vehicles. American soldiers, trained for high-tech warfare, climbed into saddles. They rode on horseback alongside Afghan mujahideen through mountain passes. They used laser designators to guide bombs while riding animals. At first glance, a primitive cavalry charge, but in reality, a coordinated lethal strike. The strategy seemed flawless. The Taliban defense lines crumbled. Cities fell faster than the Pentagon predicted. Mazar-e-Sharif was taken. Then, the capital, Kabul. Finally, the spiritual stronghold of Kandahar. In the frame, abandoned Soviet-era tanks rusting on the roadside. Taliban fighters fled their posts. They left behind heavy weapons and stockpiles of ammunition. American commanders looked at the maps and saw total dominance. In Washington, the mood was triumphant. The public believed the war would be over in months. But this was a dangerous illusion. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had simply changed tactics. They avoided direct confrontation with American firepower. Instead, they retreated into the White Mountains. They vanished into the labyrinth of caves in Tora Bora. Others slipped across the porous border into Pakistan. They traded black turbans for civilian clothes. They melted into the villages. They hid in mud brick houses and waited for the airstrikes to stop. They were no longer an army on a battlefield. They became ghosts. The trap had just been set. 2002. The war did not end. It mutated. In the jagged mountains of Bakhtia and Khost, patrols stopped finding the enemy. The enemy found them. Taliban fighters mastered the art of patience. They lay motionless along the ridgelines for hours, covered by dust and wool blankets. They did not strike randomly. They studied the maps. They memorized the American patrol routes and marked the blind spots. Why did the convoys keep walking into fire? They relied on technology. But satellites could not see men hiding under rocks. Once the soldiers entered the narrow passes, the trap snapped shut. The silence shattered instantly. Rocket-propelled grenades screamed down from the cliffs. Machine gun fire hammered the lead vehicles. There was no room to maneuver. But this was only the beginning. In March, Command launched Operation Anaconda. The objective was the Shahikat Valley. The goal, to crush the remaining al-Qaeda cells. The troops moved in, believing the area was secure. At first glance, a standard sweep operation, but in reality, a slaughterhouse. Intelligence had failed. The valley was not empty. More than 1,000 fighters had dug into the mountain face. They occupied complex cave systems and fortified bunkers. The Americans were caught in a brutal crossfire. The battle raged for over 2 weeks. The footage shows mortar rounds exploding across the valley floor. Tracers arc from high peaks down to the American positions. Reinforcements tried to help. Helicopters approached the landing zones, but heavy caliber rounds tore through their fuselages. High lines were cut. Roads became death traps. Then the weather turned. Thick fog descended. Snow covered the tracks. The terrain became a freezing, deadly maze. The toll was heavy. 8 American soldiers were killed. Dozens were wounded. Afghan allies and coalition partners also suffered losses. The valley was eventually cleared, but the cost was absolute. 2004 marked a turning point. The rules of engagement vanished overnight. The insurgents realized they could not win a direct fight, so they shifted tactics. They began using IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These were homemade bombs, crude and cheap, but the impact was devastating. With limited funds and basic supplies, Taliban fighters created weapons that halted the most powerful military machine on Earth. Why did they switch tactics? Conventional battles were losing strategies, so they weaponized the earth itself. They buried the explosives under the dusty trails of Afghanistan. They hid charges in innocent piles of rocks. They disguised bombs inside yellow plastic fuel jugs, or even within the rotting carcasses of dead animals on the roadside. Wires stretched beneath the sand. They led to a triggerman watching from a distant ridge, his thumb hovering over a button. Or they connected to a simple pressure plate buried inches below the surface. Soldiers driving through had no warning. One moment, the patrol was routine. The men joked over the intercom. The radio crackled with chatter. The next moment, a deafening roar shattered the silence. An explosion tore the lead vehicle apart. Metal, fire, and pulverized concrete sprayed into the air. But this was just the start. The provinces of Kandahar and Helmand became the deadliest sectors on the map. These were the heartlands of the Taliban. Convoys moving through villages or open highways faced attacks almost daily. The standard Humvee became a death trap. It was built for speed, not survival. Its flat bottom and thin armor offered zero defense against a subterranean blast. At first glance, a tactical vehicle, but in reality, a coffin on wheels. When an IED detonated, the energy shot straight up. Shrapnel ripped through the floorboards. It cut down everyone inside instantly. The Pentagon realized the crisis. They rushed to introduce heavier armor. They deployed MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. These monsters were designed for one purpose: survival. They featured V-shaped hulls that deflected the blast wave outward, away from the crew cabin. Grainy helmet cam footage records the results. The smoke clears, the tires are blown off, but the capsule remains intact. They saved countless lives. But the enemy adapted again. The bombs grew larger. Instead of one artillery shell, they buried 3. The force became overwhelming. Some charges were massive enough to flip a 30-ton vehicle upside down. The trucks landed on their roofs. Hatches jammed. Flames spread inside the cabin while the crew was trapped. Terror gripped the drivers. Every patrol became a psychological ordeal. Soldiers stared at the road for hours. Every loose rock, every pile of dirt, even a plastic bag blowing in the wind. Was it trash or was it a trigger? No amount of training could prepare them for the randomness. It was death by chance. 2006. That was the year the war changed forever. The Taliban looked to Iraq and imported a terrifying strategy: the suicide bomber. This was a weapon no amount of heavy armor could stop. Why was it so effective? Training counters ambushes. But nothing stops a man who has already accepted death. Insurgents packed cars with explosives. They drove at full speed toward American convoys. The drivers did not brake. The impact crumpled metal. The blast that followed incinerated Humvees. It scattered debris and flames across the asphalt. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. Events accelerated. Motorcycles became the next tool. They were small and fast. Riders wove through traffic and bypassed concrete barriers. They approached checkpoints in seconds. The sound of a high-pitched engine became a trigger for panic. An instant later, an explosion. The threat moved to the streets. Men dressed as civilians strapped bombs beneath their clothes. They walked through markets, at first glance, ordinary shoppers, but in reality, walking munitions. They waited for the crowd to thicken. Then they detonated. Suspicion became a survival skill. Soldiers watched everyone. A man carries firewood on his back. Is he heading home, or is he hiding explosives? A child runs toward the patrol. Is he looking for candy, or is he a distraction sent by the enemy? There was no clear answer. The line between friend and enemy vanished. The Taliban adapted again. They used human shields. Insurgents hid in crowded villages. They fired from homes where families lived. They knew American soldiers hesitated when civilians were nearby. It wasn't just defense, it was a calculation. They turned compassion into a tactical weakness. Soldiers faced a nightmare scenario. The camera records, a soldier's finger hovering over the trigger. He has a split second to decide: shoot and kill an innocent, or hesitate and die. July 2008. A platoon of American soldiers entered the Waigal Valley in Nuristan. Their mission was to build an outpost in the village of Wanat. The objective was clear: block the supply lines feeding the insurgency from Pakistan. But the geography was a nightmare. The location was a bowl surrounded by steep, towering ridgelines. Why did command choose this spot? It sat directly on a critical transit route, but strategically it was indefensible. At first glance, a vital foothold, but in reality, a target practice range for the enemy above. The soldiers immediately sensed the danger. They worked fast. They filled sandbags and dug trenches. But the earth was hard, and the days were short. By July 13th, the defenses were still incomplete. The HSCO barriers were only partially filled. Just before dawn, the silence broke. 4:20 in the morning, the valley exploded. Over 200 Taliban fighters initiated a coordinated assault. They didn't just attack. They unleashed a wall of fire from the high ground. Machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades rained down on the exposed Americans. The footage shows dirt and debris flying as rockets impact inside the perimeter. It was a trap. The soldiers were pinned down instantly. The base became a kill zone. Men scrambled into shallow trenches, returning fire with rifles and light machine guns. But the enemy had the angle. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The attackers moved closer. They used the terrain to creep within meters of the U.S. lines. The fighting wasn't tactical anymore. It was desperate. Soldiers fired until their barrels glowed red. In isolated positions, the Americans fought at point-blank range to keep the enemy from overrunning the wire. The audio logs record screams for ammunition and the relentless crack of incoming fire. For hours, the platoon held on against overwhelming odds. Their defensive positions collapsed one by one. The casualty count rose with every passing minute. Only when Apache helicopters screamed overhead did the tide turn. Reinforcements landed. The heavy air support forced the Taliban back into the mountains, but the rescue came too late for many. The smoke cleared to reveal the cost. 9 American soldiers were dead. 27 were wounded. The base was a ruin. The attack proved the insurgency could mass large forces and threaten fixed positions. The outpost was abandoned shortly after. The valley belonged to the mountains again. October 3rd, 2009. At 6 in the morning, the mountains of Nuristan exploded. Combat Outpost Keating sat at the bottom of a deep funnel-like valley. 54 American soldiers were stationed there. Steep rock faces towered over them on all 4 sides. The geography made defense nearly impossible. Why was the base built in such a vulnerable spot? Commanders believed it would restrict the flow of insurgents, but the soldiers knew the truth. They were targets in a fishbowl. At first glance, a strategic position, but in reality, a trap waiting to be sprung. The enemy utilized the terrain perfectly. 300 Taliban fighters lined the ridges above. They looked down into the base and opened fire. It was a deluge of lead. Heavy machine gun rounds rained down from the high ground. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the barracks. Mortars cracked against the concrete. The footage shows thick black smoke blocking out the sun. Chaos took over. The Tactical Operations Center caught fire. Vehicles exploded in the yard. Communication lines snapped. Officers screamed orders into dead radios. The soldiers had nowhere to run. They could only dig in. It got worse. The enemy breached the wire. Taliban fighters poured into the perimeter. The battle shifted to close quarters. Americans fought back-to-back against the attackers just meters away. It was no longer a tactical engagement. It was a brawl for survival. In the frame, exhausted men firing blindly through clouds of dust. Air support arrived, but the pilots struggled. The enemy hid in the rocks and caves, invisible from the air. The fight dragged on for 12 hours. The outpost was eventually secured, but the cost was absolute destruction. The buildings were ashes, the defenses were gone. The military leadership looked at the ruins and made the decision. They bombed the remains and abandoned the valley. Thus ended the battle for the low ground. August 2012. The month brought a specific kind of horror to the deployment. The United States military had a clear strategy: train the Afghan National Army and equip the local police. The goal was to hand over the war. American troops lived in the same barracks as the recruits. They ate the same rations in the mess halls. On the firing range, instructors stood inches away from their students. They taught them to clear rooms. They taught them to aim. But hidden within this closeness was a fatal flaw. Why did the Taliban change tactics? Direct combat against U.S. Marines was costly, but infiltration was cheap and deadly. The insurgents realized they did not need to storm the fortified gates. They simply walked through the front door. They sent loyal fighters to the recruitment centers. These men shaved their beards. They put on government uniforms. They accepted American rifles and waited. At first glance, a loyal ally. But in reality, an executioner waiting for a signal. From 2010 to 2012, the green-on-blue attacks spiked. The term referred to Afghan forces attacking their Western partners. It happened during gym sessions. It happened on joint patrols. It happened inside command centers. The trainee turned his weapon on the trainer. 15 Americans died this way in August alone. But the psychological toll was heavier than the body count. It was the intimacy of the violence. Soldiers who shared jokes and photos of their kids in the morning were enemies by the afternoon. The footage shows chaos in a secure base, overturned tables, bullet holes in the walls of the canteen. There was no warning. Some attackers were deep-cover Taliban operatives. Others were coerced. Insurgents sent them photos of their families with guns held to their heads. The motive did not matter. The result was the same. Trust evaporated. Paranoia took over the bases. American soldiers stopped sleeping without their pistols. They wore body armor inside the wire. Even operational meetings became standoffs. Every handshake became a risk analysis. The partnership was supposed to save Afghanistan. Instead, it became a game of survival. August 6, 2011. A heavy Chinook transport helicopter cut through the darkness over the Tangi Valley in Wardak province. Call sign, Extortion 17. The mission was urgent. The crew was flying to support Rangers pinned down in a firefight below. Inside the fuselage, 38 people prepared for the landing zone. The payload included 30 Americans, 7 Afghan commandos, and 1 civilian interpreter. Among them sat 22 Navy SEALs. Most belonged to the elite Gold Squadron of SEAL Team 6. This was the same unit that had raided Abbottabad and killed Osama bin Laden just 3 months earlier. But history did not protect them. As the Chinook lowered its ramp, a flash lit up the valley floor. Taliban fighters hidden in the rocky terrain fired a rocket-propelled grenade. It was a direct hit on the rear rotor assembly. The footage shows the massive aircraft spins violently, loses lift, and slams into the earth. There was no time to react. The crash was catastrophic. Fire engulfed the wreckage immediately. Everyone on board died instantly. In seconds, the United States military suffered its single deadliest day in the entire war. Why did this happen to the best of the best? They had air superiority and advanced night vision, but a cheap, unguided rocket proved that in Afghanistan, technology does not guarantee survival. The Taliban wasted no time. They turned the tragedy into a weapon. The camera records, insurgents celebrating near the smoldering debris, holding up seized equipment. Their message was clear. No unit was untouchable. Even the killers of bin Laden could be destroyed. They used the attack to recruit new fighters and boost morale across the insurgency. In the United States, the news hit like a physical blow. Military families received the calls they dreaded most. The grief was absolute. These men were the tip of the spear, the strongest warriors the nation had. Yet, they were gone. But this disaster was only a symptom of a wider failure. Events accelerated. The public began to ask hard questions. Why were so many dying after 10 years of occupation? In 2010, President Obama had deployed 30,000 additional troops. This was the surge. The goal was to push deep into Taliban strongholds, crush the resistance with overwhelming numbers, and hand control to the Afghan government. At first glance, a solid military strategy. But in reality, it was a descent into a meat grinder. The violence exploded. The Taliban did not retreat. They planted thousands of homemade bombs. The fighting became the most intense of the conflict. The numbers told a grim story. In 2010 alone, nearly 500 American soldiers were killed in action. The following year, another 400 flags draped coffins. These 2 years became the bloodiest period for U.S. forces. The hospitals filled up. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated with horrific injuries. Improvised explosive devices severed legs and arms. The camera records, medevac helicopters landing constantly, rotors kicking up dust, medics rushing stretchers to the operating tents. The surge created more battles, but not the victory the generals promised. Patrols faced a maddening cycle. Soldiers would clear a village and secure the area by day. They would raise the Afghan flag. But as soon as the sun set, the Taliban returned. The enemy owned the night. Troops walked roads laced with pressure plates, knowing every step could trigger a detonation. Exhaustion set in. By 2012, frustration replaced motivation. Soldiers looked at the maps and realized the truth. They were fighting for the same valleys, the same villages over and over again. The enemy seemed endless. Every tactical gain evaporated the moment the Americans turned their backs. The war had no clear finish line. In 2013. The withdrawal orders arrived from Washington. The United States began the massive task of pulling its troops out of Afghanistan. Bases and remote outposts were stripped of sensitive equipment. Control passed to the Afghan army and local police. At first glance, a sign of progress, but in reality, a strategic vacuum. The Taliban never really left. They waited in the tree lines and mountain caves. As soon as the Americans cleared a sector, the fighters returned. For the U.S. soldiers who remained, the war turned into a repetition of violence. Why fight for the same hill twice? The strategy demanded it. But the logic was hard to find. A town secured with heavy losses in 2014 often fell back to the enemy within months. By the next year, the cycle repeated. The war felt stuck in a loop. There was no finish line. The Afghan security forces were expected to stand firm. Instead, they struggled to survive. Units were poorly supplied. Corruption ate through the ranks. The footage shows soldiers arguing over ammunition, checkpoints abandoned in the dust. Many deserted. Others played a double game, working secretly with the Taliban. This left American troops furious. They watched their hard-won gains unravel in real time. By 2016, the U.S. footprint changed. Forces moved to a support role. They trained troops. They called in airstrikes. They conducted lethal night raids. But the danger did not recede. Every patrol carried the threat of death. Roadside bombs exploded. Ambushes struck from the flanks. The sound of sirens cut through the air. Americans and Afghans continued to fall. Summer of 2021. The United States prepared to close the book on 20 years of war. It was not a slow, organized exit. Bases were stripped bare, equipment was destroyed or packed into cargo holds. Thousands of troops boarded transport planes, leaving the dust of Afghanistan behind. The mission shifted. The goal was no longer combat, it was extraction. The priority was to rescue American citizens, allies, and the Afghan families who had aided the coalition. Before the Taliban could fully seize the country, everyone had to leave. Kabul International Airport became the center of gravity. Every day the pressure mounted. Thousands of desperate people flooded the perimeter. The heat was suffocating. The noise of weeping children and shouting soldiers filled the air. Families pressed against the concrete blast walls, waving documents, begging for entry. The scene was overwhelming. Soldiers stood on the barriers, pulling people from the crush, trying to maintain order while scanning for suicide vests. Why did the situation collapse so fast? Intelligence predicted a slow Taliban advance, but on August 15th, the insurgents entered Kabul. There was no resistance. The capital fell in hours. This changed the tactical reality instantly. The airport was no longer just a transport hub. It was the only lifeboat in a sinking city. American troops and Allied forces worked 24-hour shifts to keep the runway open. It became one of the largest airlifts in history. But the danger was never far away. The Taliban were now policing the city streets, yet a different enemy lurked in the shadows. ISIS-K, the local branch of the Islamic State, saw an opportunity. They wanted to prove their relevance. They saw the dense crowds as a perfect kill zone. At first glance, a chaotic humanitarian operation, but in reality, a static target for terrorists. August 26, 2021. Abbey Gate. U.S. Marines were physically searching civilians inches from the gate. A single figure slipped into the mass of people. He didn't run, he simply detonated the vest. The explosion was massive. It ripped through the stagnant air. Ball bearings and shrapnel tore through flak jackets and traditional clothing alike. The canal water turned red. In 1 second, 13 American lives ended. 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, 1 Army soldier. Alongside them, more than 170 Afghan civilians perished. These were people who were moments away from safety. The footage shows smoke rising over the gathered crowds. Screams replaced the mechanical hum of aircraft engines. Survivors scramble over the fallen. It was a shock to the system. The attack happened at the very finish line of America's longest conflict. It was the final deadly strike on U.S. forces in the region, sealing the war's end in blood. The evacuation resumed, but the atmosphere shifted. Sorrow hung heavy in the air. Soldiers carried the weight of the dead. They loaded the final caskets onto the gray C-17s. Families back home received the notification they had feared for 2 decades. The war was over.